In this video, I'm going to show you how to install and set up Cocoa Pods. Cocoa Pods is what's known as a dependency manager. And essentially, it allows you to very easily install frameworks and libraries into your projects. So we're used to adding frameworks over here in settings and build phases and link binary with libraries. And we still can do that with all these standard iOS libraries. But if we want to use an external library such as AdMob, as we'll be doing in the next video, then it can be a bit of a hassle downloading it, dragging it, and copying it over. Cocoa Pods makes the whole process a lot more straightforward. And it's actually really easy to install. If we look on the Cocoa Pods page, it's simply one line of code, which is always nice. To enter that line of code, type Command space on your map to bring up Spotlight, or click on the magnifying glass in the corner, and then type terminal. And this will allow you to open the command line for your Mac, where you can do all sorts of things, but the one thing we're going to do is install Cocoa Pods. So just copy that line in. Sudo means super user do. It allows us to install things, and we're going to install what's known as a gem, so essentially a program. And the program that we're going to install is Cocoa Pods. And then you'll have to enter your Mac password, and then that will download and install Cocoa Pods for you. While that's going, we're going to just install a test framework, and the test framework that we're going to install is called Alamo Fire. And this is actually one of the most popular frameworks available, and essentially it makes networking a lot more straightforward and in many cases faster. So you can do things like process JSON files much more straightforwardly than you can in standard Swift, and do all these things as well. If you want to experiment with other frameworks, then feel free to Google popular iOS frameworks and you'll get various lists of frameworks that it might be worth getting to know. We'll work with Alamo Fire for this video. All right, so we'll need a new Xcode project to work with. You can use an existing one if you like, but we'll have Alamo Fire demo. We're not actually going to do anything with Alamo Fire. We're just going to set it up as a framework and verify that it's there after we've gone through the Cocoa Pod process. So let's have a look over in terminal. And now you can see I've got an error here, which I thought I'd leave in because several of you might have the same error. So Cocoa Pods runs on a language called Ruby, a programming language, and it requires a certain version of Ruby. And my machine doesn't have that version installed. So to fix this, we need to do two things. The first is to install a Ruby version manager, which is something that manages the Ruby version on your machine, and then use that to switch to a Ruby version of 2.2.2. So I'm going to quickly go back to Chrome and Google RVM, which is short for Ruby Version Manager. And then I'm going to click on installing RVM, and that gives us the lines of code that we need to set that up. So here you can install the public key, which will verify the software for you, but that requires installing GPG2, which also requires installing some other software. So I'm going to bypass that step, but you can follow the guide here in security if you want to install that. I'm going to go straight to the install RVM stable with Ruby. So I'm going to copy that line, back over to terminal, paste it in, and then wait while that downloads the RVM, the Ruby Version Manager, and installs it. You can see it adds various code, and then we're good to go. And then you need to close your terminal window and open up a new one. just to restart everything. And now you'll be able to use rvm install 2.2.2 to install the 2.2.2 version of Ruby. And press enter there. Enter again, and then enter your password. This is also installing Homebrew, which you may or may not use at some point, but it allows you to install new software quite easily. Now it's installing some other packages that we're going to need. Then you need to enter your password again. And then we're done. So now if you want, you can use rvm use 2.2.2 just to check, yep, we're now using version 2.2.2. So finally, we can use the up arrow to go back and find the original command, sudo gem install cocoapods, and this should now work absolutely fine. Here we go, so you can see the process is getting much further than it did last time. There we go. And now finally, you can use pod setup to set up cocoapods on your machine. And there we go. So that's now completed. That did take about 10 minutes for me, so you might want to take a little break while that's working. So now we're going to see how to use cocoapods to add the Alamo Fire framework to our app. So first off, we find our app and we change directory to it in the terminal command line. So it's in the desktop and in Alamo Fire demo. So I can just use cd for change directory and then desktop. That will get me in the desktop, and then cd Alamo Fire demo. We get a little error there because I've perhaps foolishly put a space in the folder name, but we can fix that by typing the first few letters of the folder name and then pressing the tab key, and that will predict it for you so that you can open folders with a space in the file name. If you don't want to use that method, you can just put a backslash before the space so that it knows that it's a space which is part of the file name. And now that we're there, we can type pod init to initialize cocoapods for this particular app. There we go, that's done. And then we create essentially a config file, which is called a pod file for cocoapods. And we do that by typing open and then -a and then Xcode with a capital X and pod file with a capital P. And that will open a new pod file in Xcode that we can then edit to set up our cocoapod pod file. So now if we go back into Finder and into the Alamo Fire demo folder, you can see we've now got this pod file. I'm going to open it up in Xcode. Just because that'll make sure that the characters are saved correctly, and we'll get all the indentation as well. So File, Open, and then click on the pod file and click Open. And this is what it looks like. So it's got comments which start with the hash symbol there. So uncomment this line to define a global platform for your project. Let's do that. So that's a minimum iOS version of 9.0. And then for the target Alamo Fire demo, we're doing this. And there's only one actual line of code there, and that's use frameworks. You can see we've got an instruction, comment this line if you're not using Swift and don't want to use dynamic frameworks. We are using Swift and we do want to use dynamic frameworks. So We're not going to comment that out. And then this is where we're going to put all of the pods for Alamo Fire demo. And in fact, we're only going to use one, the Alamo Fire framework or pod. And we do that using pod, Alamo Fire, and then the version that we want, I'm going to use version 2.02. If you want to quickly jump back to cocoapods.org and search for Alamo Fire, you can see the name and the latest version there. In fact, maybe I'll use 3.4.1. Here you go. You get all the features and also some usage instructions as well. So for example, that's how you get a URL and some JSON using Alamo Fire. So let's go back and update that to version 3.4.1 and then save the pod file, and I'll close that down, and I'll actually close Xcode as well, which is a good idea because that might make edits to the Xcode file. And now we use pod install, and that will use the pod fire to download the dependencies. So there you go. We're getting our Alamo Fire version 3.4.1. And now, hurrah, we're done. Notice this line, please close the current Xcode sessions and use Alamo Fire demo.exe workspace for this project from now on. So that's a slightly different file than we're used to working with, which just includes all of the pods and information that we've just added to our file. So you should use exe workspace from now on, not Xcode project. So what does our Alamo Fire demo look like? It looks like we might need to update some of that for Swift 3. Well, we'll leave that to the Alamo Fire team. You can see we've still got the same settings there, but we have a new pods folder here, which has got our Alamo Fire framework in it and all the necessary files that come with it. And then just seeing very quickly how we would use that over in viewcontroller.swift. If we go back to our guide on cocoapods.org, you can see we can use import Alamo Fire. So import Alamo Fire. And unfortunately here we do get an error because it looks like Alamo Fire is not yet compatible with Swift 3. But if and when it is, then this will be successful and we could start using the code here, for example, to get some JSON and then process it. So there you go. That's the basics of CocoaPods. It might feel like a lot of work to set up when you could just drag and drop a framework in there. And indeed, if that's all you want to do on a kind of one-off basis, then dragging and dropping is probably the best bet. But using CocoaPods allows you to set up multiple frameworks for each project. And if you start to use the same frameworks again and again, it can save you a lot of time by importing everything that you need in one go, especially if you save your own pod files so that you can just paste those in and it will all get set up every time you create a new iOS app. So I hope you enjoy working with CocoaPods. Now let's go on and see some more advanced features in iOS development.